One of the labels that often gets attached to the political situation in the High Middle Ages is this term papal monarchy. The papacy itself became and functioned like a kingdom or an empire. And I wanted to deal with the term a little bit, talk through it, right, and detail some of the events and things that went along with this growing power of the papacy in the 12th and 13th centuries. We talked already about the investiture controversy, so I don't want to go on at length about that, but that was really just the first of a sequence of contests between ecclesiastical authorities, usually the Pope, but also other ecclesiastical leaders. This was followed by a number of them, and I've listed just a couple of others. The contention between King Henry II of England and Thomas Becket, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1160s. Thomas Becket had been a friend of Henry II, and he was named Chancellor of England. And then, sort of trying to control the church, it seemed, Henry named him Archbishop of Canterbury. And in England, the king tended to appoint the churchmen, and even the very high positions in the church, like the Archbishops of Canterbury and York. And Becket did an about-face at that point and became a committed churchman and began defending the privileges of the church, specifically the ability of the church to try people under canon law if they were members of the clergy. And Henry was trying to claim secular jurisdiction over him. This led to the murder of Thomas Becket. It seems with the encouragement of Henry, though there's some question of whether he truly intended this or whether some of his knights just took his meaning. I mean, there's a kind of famous scene in, there have been several works of literature and film and things written about this, but T.S. Eliot wrote a play called Murder in the Cathedral. There was a 1965 film called Becket. And the famous line in that film is, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" Right? Where Henry says that, and some of his knights they kind of wink at each other, like, okay, the king wants us to go kill Becket, right? So they do. But this led to Henry having to save face by doing penance, public penance, before the canons of the cathedral, or rather the monks. There was a monastic community in the cathedral in Canterbury, and he had to kind of march through them with his shirt off, and they pelted him with garbage. This is, public humiliation for the king. But at the same time, Henry didn't ultimately give up his power over the church, right? So that would be his son John, who really lost a contest with the later pope, and I'll talk about that in a minute here. Another one of note was the tendency that the popes of the second half of the 12th century had in siding with this organization of Italian cities called the Lombard League, which was formed partly as an economic partnership, but partly to fend off attempts of the German emperors to control their affairs. Starting in this was during the reign of Frederick I of Germany, or as he's called, Frederick Barbarossa, apparently because he had a red beard. Frederick I was a tremendously powerful emperor. I mentioned him in the Crusades. He was the one who drowned in a river in Turkey during the Crusades, or in Anatolia, I should say. But he had been a really effective emperor and was trying everything he could to control and tax the cities of northern Italy, these wealthy, powerful, populous cities. The popes at that point started to ally with the cities in order to fend off this imperial power, or to weaken it, to keep it at bay. And this led in many parts of Italy and even in Germany to the formation of these, what amounted to like political parties. In German, the Welfs and the Weiblings. In Italian, the Guelfs and the Ghibellines. And these would remain in force through the 13th century, or into the 13th century, I should say, and I'll kind of pick that up later. They're even still around during the life of Dante, and that affects Dante, who we'll talk about in a later video. The papacy reaches its height with the reign, the papal tenure of Innocent III. and I neglected to put the dates on here. Apologies for that. He became Pope in 1198 and ruled until 1216. So right at the turn of the 12th to the 13th century. When he became Pope, he was actually the youngest cardinal in the church. He was only 37 years old. He was an Italian. His name was Lothario de Segni. And unlike most of the popes who had preceded him, he did not come from a monastery, or he did not begin his career as a clergyman as a monk. Instead, he was a student of canon law. He became a priest and later a bishop and archbishop, rose to a position of cardinal and was elected by his older peers as the pope. And he was an energetic person, had written some important treatises on canon law. So he was well respected within the papal curia, and his 18-year rule represents a kind of zenith of papal power. Innocent believed firmly in the notion that the papacy held, and the Latin term here is plenitudo potestatis, a fullness of power is what that means. Meaning that they could interfere in anything, secular or sacred. They could pronounce on absolutely any issue, even down to the level of like private relationships, right? The popes of the 13th century, Innocent III himself and others, had plenty to say about, for instance, the sexual relationship within marriage. They tried to regulate that very strictly. They, had to give, in their mind, had to give permission to kings and nobles to enter into a marriage union. And if they opposed it for some political reason or something like that, it was difficult for even royals to kind of get around papal permission to get married to someone. And so, this, and Innocent, earlier popes had claimed this more or less. Innocent not only claimed it, but he ruled with this in mind, with this as his vision, and for the most part, he was able to pull it off. A few examples of this. Innocent's a fascinating figure. There's a really good biography of him that came out a few years ago that I would highly recommend if you're, kind of want to pursue this further. So one example of his attempt to control just about everything, right? So the son of Frederick Barbarossa, Henry VI, was married to Constance, a princess of Sicily, but her nephew, the nephew of Constance, whose name was William, so these are the Norman kings of Sicily, right? William was younger than her and was ruling, and the assumption was that he would produce an heir. And so the early, I think it was Pope Innocent, not Innocent, but Urban III had blessed the union, thinking that, Constance's issue would never have any claim to the throne of Sicily. Now, the Pope's greatest fear was that they would be surrounded by somebody who controlled territory to the north and the south of them. The German emperors controlled the territory to the north, the Norman kings to the south, and the worst nightmare for a pope would be the union of those two royal houses, okay? Well, Henry VI had married Constance, and then William of Sicily ended up dying, leaving no heirs, and Constance became the heir to the Sicilian throne. She gave birth to a child who was named Frederick, and so Frederick, the would-be Frederick II, and he did later become Frederick II, was set to inherit the thrones of both Germany and Sicily. Well, Innocent inserted himself into this and convinced Constance. Constance actually died shortly after. Henry died actually 3 years after Frederick was born, and Constance died shortly after him, leaving him only 3-year-olds, right, to inherit the throne. But she made Frederick a ward of the papacy, meaning the Pope essentially became the guardian of this young man who was set to grow up and inherit the throne, and Innocent could essentially broker the terms of his inheritance. Now, we'll see later that Frederick is able to maneuver his way out of that arrangement, especially after the death of Innocent III. But you can see the level of power that Innocent had, that he could make decisions about who inherited what throne and things like this. His greatest failure, though it still represents the level of power that he held, was the Fourth Crusade. And we've already talked about this, so I don't want to belabor the point, right? But think of the audacity of this, right? The Pope says here, in the earlier Crusades, kings and nobles were in control of these things, and they were all colossal failures. And so this crusade is going to be different, right? This is going to be directed by the Pope, which means it will have the sanction of God like no earlier crusade had. Of course, Innocent was not going to accompany the Crusaders on crusades, and he tried to do this through messengers. It took a long time to travel from the crusading army to Rome, and so he was always behind the times, and the thing completely got away from him. He condemned just about everything that happened on the Fourth Crusade, though ultimately when the crusade took over Constantinople, he did not see that as necessarily a bad thing, because if he could have a Latin ally on the throne of Constantinople, he could put into effect his vision for controlling not only the Latin church, but also the Greek church, right? So he more or less blessed the ultimate result of the taking of Constantinople, but he wasn't happy through the whole course of the thing. He had greater success in his contention with King John of England. So this is the youngest son of Henry II. He was never supposed to inherit the throne, but his older brother Richard, of course, died, and John was the only son left at that point. He was, I think, the fourth son of Henry and Eleanor of Aquitaine. But in any case, John became the king in 1198, the very same year that Innocent, or maybe it was 1199, but right around the time that Innocent became pope. And a few years into his reign, I think this was 1206, the Archbishop of Canterbury died, and there was a new election to determine who would be the bishop. And the Pope put a candidate forward, or I should say, the canons proposed one, and the king proposed another candidate. And Innocent vetoed all of these and named, just outright said, the next Archbishop of Canterbury is going to be this guy. And his name was Stephen Langton, actually. He's a prominent bishop there and an ally of the papacy. And John refused to accept Stephen Langton. And so Innocent, using the sharpest arrow in his quiver, not only excommunicated John, but he put the entire kingdom of England under what's called interdict, which is a situation, and this is proclaimed by the Pope, and Innocent used this not only here, but in France later and some other places. But this means that no sacraments can be performed in the entire kingdom. If people have a child, the child cannot be baptized. If the child dies before baptism, they go to limbo, right? They go to hell. That was the belief. No marriages can be performed. No priest can be ordained. No one can receive the Eucharist. No one can go to confession. And so this is a really serious thing, and ultimately this led to lots of hardships in England. John tried to hold out, but a few years into this, he capitulated. And the terms of this capitulation were that he would hand over the entire kingdom of England. Now, this is really only symbolic, but it's a powerful symbol. He would hand over the kingdom of England to the Pope. The Pope would be the rightful king of England, but then, of course, Innocent gave it back as a fief to John, naming him king of England. The symbolism of the thing is important here, right? That Innocent is the one making John king of England, that he holds the privilege of kingship over the whole kingdom of England. And, to help John out, he tried to condemn Magna Carta, which was also being formulated around the same time. We'll talk about that later. But John really could do little in the face of this. Now, later, Innocent tried to put France under interdict as well to force some changes from Philip II. And Philip never fully capitulated to this, even though, both sides kind of did some face-saving gestures. But, Innocent tried this in France as well. The greatest accomplishment, arguably, of Innocent III was the calling and presiding over of the Fourth Lateran Council. There had been several church councils over the course of the 12th century with these increasingly confident and powerful popes, and they had made important changes in the way that Christianity functions and solidified things that had been in formulation for some time. The Fourth Lateran Council sees the papacy at the height of its power. And this is one of the sources in Geary, so I wanted to take a look at a few of the things here. This council lasted for only 3 weeks. It was a very short thing, but over the course of those 3 weeks, the 400 gathered bishops and 800 gathered abbots put into place. I mentioned that the building of churches by the turn of the 11th century was kind of the representation of the fullness of Christianization. We might say that the Fourth Lateran Council is the ultimate realization of the process of Christianization, in that it firmly establishes and standardizes the practices of the church in so many ways. Okay, I'm not going to take you through every one of these canons. There are 71 canons of the council. One of the things that it pronounces about is heresy. I'm going to do a separate video about the rise of heresy in the High Middle Ages. A fascinating topic, in my opinion. But the third canon, we excommunicate and anathematize every heresy setting itself up against the Holy Orthodox Catholic faith, and so forth and so on. Right. So I'll say more about heresy. Innocent also called the Albigensian Crusade and other things, and put into place the Inquisition. But we need to talk about that in association with heresy. Here he claims supremacy over the Greek Church. He says that basically he is saying that after the pontiffs of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, these are the 4 Eastern Patriarchs, who claim to have authority equal to that of the Pope. After they have received the pallium, this is a symbol of the office of Patriarch. It's kind of a drape over the shoulder thing. Look up and do a Google search for pallium. You'll see what it looks like. Which is the distinguishing mark of the plenitude of the pontifical office from the Roman pontiff. So the Pope is the one who gives the pallium to these other patriarchs, and taking an oath of fealty and obedience to him, then they have authority to preside over their church, right? But they are obedient and loyal to and subordinate to, right, the Roman Pope. Let's see, what other things here? There's a lot here about the sacraments, and maybe the most important, a lot of regulation of religious orders. This one is not ultimately obeyed very well. We firmly forbid anyone in future to invent a new religious order. This is a period of the creation of a lot of religious orders, and we'll talk later about the Franciscans and Dominicans, who were solidified at the Fourth Lateran Council. They were given permission to exist, but then they tried to stop any future religious orders. Obviously, there are some developed later, like the Trappists and the Jesuits and several during the Reformation period. But they're trying to standardize the creation of religious orders. And one of the great abuses in the church happened when clergymen were pursuing other vocations, who were getting involved in business. They tried to put a stop to that here. And of course, they forbid clergy from doing anything dishonorable, like watching mimes. That apparently was a really scandalous thing, to watch a mime show, to watch mimes, entertainers, and actors, and not to frequent taverns at all, unless compelled of necessity to do so on a journey. I don't know what necessity would be, like I'm really thirsty, or it's probably I need a place to stay, right? Here's maybe the ultimate regulation that extends down to the level of every individual in Christendom, that after they reach the years of discretion, they shall confess their sins at least once a year to their priest, and do the penance imposed on them, and they will receive the sacrament of the Eucharist at least at Easter, right? So this establishes a minimum requirement for every Christian, that they confess their sins at least once a year, and at least once a year receive the Eucharist. Okay, that might not seem like a lot, but this is a big step. I mean, this means that that's possible, and it probably was possible by this period for people to have access to a church at least once a year. A lot of regulation of the corruption of the church. The one I wanted to get to is right at the very end. I'm not going to deal with all of this, okay? I just made some notes here. But in the last few canons, there's a fair number of pronouncements on the position of Jews and, to a lesser extent, Muslims within Christian society, right? And so one of the things that Innocent tried to do was to forbid, or at least curtail, the Jewish practice of charging interest on loans to Christians. This is one of the ways the Jews were able to survive, as they became money lenders. It's not the only occupation the Jews pursued. That's kind of a stereotype of Jews in the Middle Ages, but it was something they did commonly, and they charged interest on loans, usury, right? And Innocent tried to stop that. This was really quite ineffective. It didn't stop the practice of usury, and in fact, many Christians were also loaning money and charging interest, which was supposed to be expressly forbidden. The one that probably has gotten the most attention in the study of the history of this period is this one where the 68th canon of the Fourth Lateran Council tries to say that Jews and Muslims need to wear distinctive clothing when they're in Christian society. And even though that probably was not enforced very much or very evenly, this does have an effect on, for instance, art in churches, right? Where perhaps to try to reinforce this, Christian artists began to depict Jews wearing distinctive clothing. This usually was either a hat that they were supposed to wear, usually colored yellow, or more commonly, they had to wear a circle of red cloth somewhere on their person to mark them out as Jews. This is not dissimilar from what the Nazis tried to do with the Yellow Star. Once they take control of places like Poland, and even in Germany, that was the case in the 1940s. But I don't want to draw too direct a line from this. There certainly are medieval precedents, though, for some of the things that happened to the Jews in the modern period. Okay, let me get through just a few more points here, right? So we can say that the elements of papal monarchy, and all of these can be seen in the Fourth Lateran Council, are that it has its own legal system. Canon law is the law of the church, and Innocent was from that background. He was a canon lawyer and a scholar of canon law, right? So it has its own legal system. It has its own, we might say, legislature, right? The College of Cardinals, or at least I guess it's more of a bureaucracy. But they're the one. There's an established procedure for choosing the Pope. The College of Cardinals, these members have power. They are advisors to the Pope. There is, in addition to that, the Papal Curia, and this is something that's put into place in the Fourth Lateran Council, that there are three kind of branches of the Papal Curia, or three offices, I should say, within the papal bureaucracy. The Chancery, which deals with official pronouncements, which are called bulls. That's from the Latin word bullum, which is what's used to describe these official pronouncements. The Camera, which is not for taking pictures, by the way, if you were wondering, obviously, but is the office of finances. And then finally, the Datary, which is the judicial office of the papacy, right, which is the one that enforces canon law and looks after judicial procedures. And so, this thing comes to have a bureaucratic structure resembling that of, the emerging governments of the kingdoms of Europe in this period. We might even say that the papal monarchy has a military, right, in the form of the Crusades, which are called and directed by popes. And then, this extends down to the level of the individual, that in the Fourth Lateran Council, the seven sacraments are required of everyone, that the papal reach is such that everyone is doing this thing that is commanded of them by the popes. And I think that's all I wanted to say. We'll move on and talk about kind of the secular realm and look at the development of the kingdoms in the 13th century. But I am going to do a short video, at least, on heresy as well. So thank you.